on the bottom right side where it says like reactions. You can feel free to do that as well, because that I am able to see because it moves you up to the top. So just want to make sure everyone knows that. All right. So just kind of starting from the very beginning of this class, going back in time to the first time we came together, I had asked what everyone knew about Judaism, and these were some of the things that came up for our community. Perhaps there's a lot of other things that have come to mind since, because I put you on the spot right in that moment, but this is kind of where we started from as a class. And then I had asked a question of, what do you wonder about Judaism? And these are some of the questions that we came up with. The ones that are in bold are the ones that we are going to be touching in part today. There's a lot of great questions here. Every single one of them is worthy of conversation. But of course, in a 3-week class, it's impossible to get to all of it. But as I'll mention later on, we are going to be doing an Introduction to Judaism class starting in October, if anyone wanted to be a part of that as well. Okay, so I just want to make a reminder as we're going into this particular class that together we have shared values, that we're striving to create a safe learning environment that values and supports curiosity and discovery, that honors and encourages questions, that's safe and open-minded and non-judgmental, that every single person here is welcome and celebrated, and I want everyone to feel comfortable through that as we're going forward. So we've seen this particular image twice before now, this image of this knot. And it is to be a reminder of the interlocking values within Judaism. God and spirituality, which we talked about in our very first class. Torah and values, which we began to talk about in our second class. And today, when we're talking about Israel and community, that's the third section of this. And without any one of these, Judaism wouldn't be fully represented. The three really go hand in hand like a knot. So today's class in particular, today's class is shaped around 3 questions. The first one being, who is the people of Israel? What is meant when we say people Israel? How does one become part of the Jewish people? We'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And how does Judaism understand community? So before we go any further, I just want to pause to see, are there any questions or comments up to this point? Everyone's very quiet today. It's starting to freak me out a little. I know that won't be that way for long, so. Okay, well, we're gonna be diving into this and a bunch of other things as well. What's really, really important to note as we start this conversation is that there's no one kind of model for what a Jew looks like, that there's a lot of diversity within Judaism. And we're going to talk a bit about this. And in fact, some of the slides and the things here are actually based on data from the last Pew study. There was just a Pew study, which is kind of giving us insight into the makeup of Jews throughout our country. And the newest data I'll talk a little bit about. The slides are a little bit outdated, but not much. And I'll talk you through that. But if anything, what it shows is that the Jewish community is even more diverse than perhaps we even realized it was. So I think that's really important. And that there's a variety of ethnic and racial groups within the Jewish community. And therefore, the Jewish community really is incredibly rich and varied. And at the same time, we're all part of the Jewish people, which means that there's points of connection and commonality. So what I want to do today is we're going to go into a little bit of text study. So this first section of text study that we're going to do today is something that we will do all together as a group. And then the second section of this will be in 3 distinct breakout groups. So we'll have a chance, just like we did in the first class, actually have a conversation with a smaller cohort of people, which I know people really enjoyed, and it's good that we can kind of go back to that. So when we're looking at all of these texts, we start with this particular one, which comes from Genesis, very early on in the Torah, where God is speaking to Abram. You might have heard the name Abraham. Abram and Abraham, same person. Abram becomes Abraham later on in the Torah. Right, Jim? Jim, you have a confused look on your face. Do you have a question or anything? Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just looking at the spelling of a word and I was wondering about it. That's all.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. So when in the Hebrew, he's called Abram at the very beginning and then becomes Abraham later on. There's all sorts of different teachings about that. That's for another day. But this is at the very beginning of his journey. And would anyone like to read this text for us?
I'll read it.
Oh,
go ahead. No, you go ahead, James.
okay. I will make of you a great nation. The Eternal said to Abram, go forth from your land, your birthplace, your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and it shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will pronounce doom on those who curse you. Through you, all the families of earth shall be blessed. Abram went forth as the Eternal had told him.
Okay, so this text is here. Thank you so much, Jim. This text is here because in essence, this is where Judaism began, right here. God is speaking to Abram and says, I look like I'm freezing on my screen. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
We
good.
can hear you.
Yes.
So God says to Abram, you have been raised in a community that worship many gods. Your father sold idols. That's where you come from. And yet you are being called to something different. You're being called to go on this journey, to leave the only home that you have ever known, and to go out and to start this great nation, that great nation called people Israel. And when this happens, Abram ends up going together with Sarai, his wife. Sarai becomes Sarah, just like Abram becomes Abraham. And they end up forming this nation together with a group of people who go with them on this journey. This is where Judaism is born. Any questions about this? Everyone's so quiet today.
Well, I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, yeah.
Doesn't the Islamic religion also believe that Abram or Abraham, that's where their religion began also? So
Yeah.
when you read this text, how does that apply to the Islamic faith?
Well, remember, Islam and Christianity and Catholicism all came out of Judaism. So this is the beginning of Judaism.
It's like basically, from what I understand, is like the origin point where like a lot of different little branches kind of came out essentially.
Right, exactly.
I had a question.
Yeah.
When was this? I mean, is there a year attributed to it or in time?
So there's lots of guesses. I mean, we are talking about thousands of years BC.
Rabbi Cassie, when you're very careful when you say this is when Judaism began. So my question is, this isn't when the Jewish people began, right? Or they're Israel. Who are they?
Yeah, no, this is where the people Israel began. Actually, Judaism, truthfully, if I was being a little more careful with my words, Judaism as a religion really is much later, because the idea of religion is a much later construct. This is where the Jewish people began.
Thank you.
And before they were the Jewish people, they were just idolaters.
Exactly. Yeah. Abram's father sold idols. Yeah. So this was monotheism being born right here. There's another formative text that feels really important to bring in, which is something that you might be very familiar with. Certainly, we touched on it when we were talking about God in our very first class. And this is where we actually get the name Yisrael, the name Israel as a people. Would anyone like to read this text?
Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the rise of dawn. When the man saw that he could not overcome him, he struck Jacob's hip socket, so Jacob's hip socket was wrenched as the man wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The other said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." "No more shall you be called Jacob, but Israel," said the other, "for you have struggled with God and with human beings, and you have prevailed."
Okay, so why do you think this is how we would get our name? Like, what is it about this text?
You have struggled with God and with human beings, and you have prevailed. Like you said in our first class, a key point of Judaism is always kind of being in a constant state of kind of metaphorically wrestling with God and your beliefs.
Yeah, it's not taking things at face value, it's digging deep.
But who is this man wrestling with Jacob?
That is such a good question, and we don't have an answer to it. In fact, there's so much commentary written on exactly that question, Caitlin. So some people say that the man was actually Jacob's conscience.
Yeah.
Because Jacob was about to see Esau for the first time after stealing his birthright and blessing of the firstborn. Some people say that he was actually wrestling with the spirit of Esau, who he was about to meet. Some people say that he was wrestling with an angel of God or with God, God's self. I mean, there's a lot of ideas here.
Yeah, in Kabbalah, it says that he was wrestling with his higher self so that he could so that he could actually become more godly or more God-fearing. And that was why the person he was wrestling with asked him for a blessing so that they could actually kind of come together.
Yeah, there's so much beautiful midrashim that you could do. Okay. Yeah, there's so much that you can dig into this particular text and find meaning in. So thank you for bringing that in, Richard. After looking at these two kind of origin texts of how it all kind of began, of us as a people, we can look at two more texts. Actually, no, just one text I ended up including in here, which talks to the idea of a covenant, this sacred connection that we have with God and with other people. So does anyone want to read this particular piece?
I'll do
I'll
it.
read it.
Oh,
Oh, go. All right.
Okay.
You stand this day, all of you, before your eternal God, your tribal heads, your elders, and your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your women, even the stranger with your camp, from wood chopper to water drawer, to enter into the covenant of your eternal God, which your God is concluding with you this day with its sanctions, in order to establish you this day as God's people, and in order to be your God as promised you and as sworn to your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I make this covenant with its sanctions, not with you alone, but both with those who are standing here with us this day before the eternal God, and with those who are not with us here this day.
So I know this is a little wordy and circular. What do you get out of this text? Thank you so much, Judy, for reading.
I mean, it's not just the sons and daughters of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's everyone in the camp, and those who are not with us here this day is interesting. So that is very open. That's a very open tent.
Yeah, for me, this is a contract for all time. This is the contract for the Jewish people for eternity. This is our covenant.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in here that really speak to how open it is. Like, for example, you have this kind of wording here. Your tribal heads, your elders, your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your women. So whenever you have like people in different status, like the stranger within your camp, from wood chopper to water drawer, what it's doing is it's naming extremes in society. And that is a biblical technique called a merism. And whenever you have that, whenever you have the extremes kind of labeled in the same place, it stands in for saying everyone, from one extreme to the other and everywhere in between. This is inclusive of everyone. And it happens multiple times in the Torah. So you have that technique in addition to this last line, as you pointed out, Dan, of even those who are not here with us today. This is a covenant for you too. And so it might not be surprising that this is a text that we read every Yom Kippur, one of the holiest days of the year. This is the Torah reading that we do in the midst of that day. So why is this so important?
I kind of get the idea, like I could be completely wrong, but you know, from reading this, the only thing that keeps coming into my mind is kind of remembering those that are not with us anymore and kind of remembering those who have no one to remember them by. But I don't know, that's all I kind of got from this kind of message.
Yeah, so you're saying this is inclusive of people who were around long ago. It's inclusive of people today, and it's inclusive of people in the future. So there's this continuity that goes there. There's this nod to tradition and a looking ahead. And that's really important. When you hear the word covenant, like, what do you think of? Like, enter into this covenant with your eternal God. What does that mean? What does that comprise of?
An agreement.
Yeah, and
Joining beliefs, coming together.
but a covenant also comes with, you have to give something, you have to actively be a part of it as well.
Okay, so Lynette, what you were talking to is believing in the same thing, having a shared belief system. Caitlin, what you added is having a shared values, or not even values, but turning that into action.
It's a bond.
Combination. It's a bond. Beautiful.
Yeah, it strikes me that I at one point thought I would go to law school. I sat in on exactly one session, but in that session I did learn one thing, and that is that if someone makes an offer and you accept it, then there's a contract. And it doesn't really have to be written, and this wasn't written anyway, but it seems that God made an offer, and the fact that people are standing there, they're accepting it, and so it becomes a binding contract.
It does. That's exactly right. And we're going to go to something else. So as I was planning this, it felt kind of right that we just celebrated the holiday of Shavuot, which is when we received the Torah from God. We had talked about that a little bit last time, but these ideas of a covenant are coming back into this class because we have the sacred contract. And one of the texts, as we'll get to short, yeah, it is the next one. Good, I remembered correctly. On Shavuot, we remember the story of Ruth. So Ruth was someone who's, she had a husband, and she had a sister-in-law who had a husband as well. And okay, let's say this another way. So Ruth's husband died from an illness. Ruth's mother-in-law was Naomi. Naomi's husband had also died. And in addition to Ruth's husband dying, also Naomi's other son died. So all the men in the family died. Now, the other sister-in-law, his name was Orpah. And Naomi said to Ruth and Orpah, I don't have any more sons who you can marry. You didn't have children. You're young. Go marry people from your own community. Let me go back to my Jewish people, and you can continue to live your life the way that you would have before meeting my son, right? And Orpah says, okay, I will. Have a tearful goodbye, loving goodbye with her mother-in-law. And Ruth says this instead: wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your nation is my nation, and your God is my God. In other words, Ruth was saying, no, I am connected to the Jewish people. I declare myself part of the Jewish people. I can't go back. I'm going with you to live within the Jewish community. And the rabbis uplift this beautiful verse, this beautiful statement of commitment and love to not only her mother-in-law, Naomi, but also to the entire Jewish people as a statement of great faith. And in fact, some rabbis actually say this is the first time that someone converts to Judaism with these words because they're so heartfelt. And what's really powerful to me is that we read these words and we read Ruth's story on the holiday of Shavuot when we receive the Torah from God. And why is that so important? Because if we are celebrating Revelation itself, right, that could be a particularistic holiday. That could say, this is a holiday for people who are born Jewish and people who are real Jews. It could be like that. But the rabbis say, no, 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 no. That's not who we are. Look back at the last verse of Torah that we just read. There's a wider tent than that, right? And it became a tradition right away that we read the story of Ruth and we uplift the story of Ruth. Because you know what? Ruth is as Jew, just as much of a Jew as anyone who was born part of the Jewish people. And that's a really powerful statement, I think, on that holy day of the year.
Rabbi, have you ever read this as though God were saying it?
Say more about that, Judy.
Well, let's say it's God saying, wherever you go, I will go. So God's going to be wherever you go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. God's going to be with you, and even in your home. Your nation is my nation, and your God is my God. But your God is same as me. But I think it's kind of poetic in a way. You can read all the love poems and love songs this way, like that you're pledging your love to God, especially when you're single and getting older.
I mean, I think that's beautiful, right? The love here is just it's so apparent that it's palpable. Like you can really sense the extraordinary connection that Ruth has to her mother-in-law. And I think that that's what you're speaking to, right? To feel that kind of love and that kind of connection to God, to anyone, is a powerful force.
So, Rabbi, I'm trying to understand. It's Ruth's mother-in-law, and so was Ruth's husband killed?
He died.
So Ruth's husband died, and was she a Jew when he died? And then
So she was a Moabite. She married Naomi's son Abimelech, who was a Jew or was part of people Israel. And so when she married him, she became as if she was part of the Jewish people.
Right.
But then when he died and she also didn't have any children, it was a little up in the air where her status was because of how things were at this time. It would have been easy to go back home to her parents' house and to have an arranged marriage, but that's not what she chose.
But Ruth basically said, marry whoever you want. You'll always be a Jew.
Well, I don't know about that. She didn't say you'll always be a member of people Israel, because if she had gone back to living as a Moabite, she'd be fully a Moabite. It was more, go back so you can have children. Go back so that you can live the life that you deserve to have. But she said, no, I want to have that within the Jewish people because that's who I am. Is that any clearer?
Not so
No?
much.
I think what Ruth at that point was kind of saying, at least from my understanding, and I don't really know any of the text or anything like that, but it just sounds like she was still connected, like she was connected to this community, and that was basically like her way of, maybe even with grief, like, just, I don't know, just, I think it really was just her and, what she truly felt. And she didn't want to go back to what she formerly felt she was, because she's this now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that some of the disconnect is that a status of a woman was not a full status at this time, right? And so there's a disconnect because our society, thankfully, isn't like this, right? Or at least we hope it's not. But here, a woman was entirely dependent on the males in her life. So if there wasn't a male, then the entire identity of the female was kind of up in the air.
She found her family. She found her tribe.
Exactly. Exactly.
Rabbi Cassie, I have a question. It's a little offbeat from what we were just talking about. It might be silly, but do Orthodox and conservative Jews also read this on the holiday that you mentioned?
Yes, this is a tradition across the board to read this text on Shavuot.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes there are differences between them, so it's a really good question. So one of the things that I want to talk about is actually what conversion is and what that looks like, because I know that some of you here are kind of curious about that and what that process could look like. And one of the ways to kind of understand it is like becoming a naturalized citizen in the United States, right? If you're within the US, but you're not a citizen, you can participate in just about every aspect of life in the United States. But when you become a citizen, there are ways for you to participate in a deeper kind of way. The same is true within Judaism, right? If someone isn't a Jew, but they want to participate in Jewish life, you could go to any services you want to. You could study anything that you want to. You can be part of anything within the community that you choose to. But if you became part of the Jewish people, then there now are new opportunities that are open to you because you've decided, like Ruth, this is my family, right? It's not my only family, but this is a part of who I am. This is a part of my group of people. And so you're tying your own personal destiny with that of the Jewish people, just like Ruth kind of did within her own story.
And I really like that as a person of color, because what I've been struggling with is balancing my traditions as, you know, a Mexican American with that of Judaism. So I do like how you put it, where it's like, this is my family, but it's not my only family, but it's still an integral part of who I am.
Yeah, and a little bit later, we're going to get there fairly soon, but in a little while from now, we'll talk about actually the incredible diversity within the Jewish community and how there are kind of subcultures because of that. Because I think it's something that many Jews don't know a whole lot about, and it's really important that many people in the world don't know all that much about. I think it's really important that there be more awareness about that. But yeah, I was just stopping there. Sorry, I have too many things in the way on my screen. Okay, I'm going to stop the share for a second because what I want us to do is I'd emailed everyone out the packets or the kind of text sheets. And if you have those in front of you, that will be really, really helpful. So you'll notice, I'm just going to kind of share it really quickly. Okay, so there's this section called Choosing Jewish Narratives. And there's 3 different narratives. That's one of them. Yeah, there's 3 different narratives. So what I'm actually going to do is break everyone who's here into 3 distinct groups. And I'm going to assign a narrative to each of the groups. And what I want you to do is to look at, I mean, there's questions at the end of this. Those are the questions that I want you to answer, and I'll put them in the chat as well to make that helpful. But the questions are, what did you learn about the conversion process from this person's story? What surprised you about this person's story? What do you know from the story about this person's Jewish identity, and how did they affirm their identity? Okay, so I want us just to take a few minutes to go through those. I'm going to set up random breakout groups right now, and I'll come in and I'll let you know which text is yours. Breakout rooms, 3 of them. Okay. All right, we're going to have, I think, about 10 minutes or so just to kind of go through these texts and have a conversation, maybe a little more depending on how we're doing. I'll kind of jump in, but I'm going to create the rooms now.
But we don't know what text we're reading, not yet.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to go into
Okay.
each room and I'm going to tell you, because there's no way for me to do it without doing that. I'm going to pop into each one really fast and I'll let you know.
Thanks.
We're all back.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Okay. So does anyone want to just share a little bit about what you were talking about in your group, what the story was all about and what you got out of it? What's your takeaway? Will the first group go? Someone to talk on behalf of group number 1?
I'll speak up. So our story was about a half Korean, half Jewish daughter. The father was Jewish, the mother was Korean, and it sounds like she was raised Jewish and she identified as being Jewish, but then she encountered a lot of people saying, well, you don't look Jewish, and that, I think, made her feel insecure about her Jewishness. So she went ahead and went into a conversion, or she just decided to do the conversion ritual to make herself feel more Jewish. But when she confronted her mother about it, her mother said, I don't understand why you even have to do that. How can you not be Jewish? You know, you've been Jewish all your life. It's every much a part of you as being a woman, or being Korean, or being, you know, a human being. And I thought that was really beautiful.
Thank you so much, Judy. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I also thought, as you know, a person of color who's considering converting, it's really kind of, I'm not going to say kind of, it's alienating that so many of conversion stories and so many like literature comes from a viewpoint of people who aren't people of color. So this was a very nice, I guess, viewpoint. Like, and one things that I'm worried about is incorporating again my Mexican heritage to Judaism. But when she said, "Oh, we put kimchi on the Seder plate because it's better than maror," that kind of made me feel happy, because I could figure out how to work in my heritage to Judaism, and I could kind of make new traditions.
That's beautiful. Had anyone here heard of Angela Buchdahl before?
No.
Okay, so Marla, do you want to say something about who she is?
She's the head rabbi of the huge congregation in New York City's Central Synagogue, correct?
That is exactly correct. She's actually a rabbi and a cantor. She went through school and she became both.
Right.
So
And,
this is her beginnings. Yeah.
It's a privilege to hear her and to learn from her.
Yeah, and she talks a lot about that, about just what it's like to grow up, because now I think there's more awareness about the diversity within the Jewish community than there was when she was a child. But she really grew up in a community that wasn't aware of the diversity. I think it existed, but people weren't really aware of it. And we still have a ways to go. There's no question about that. But she really jump-started, or was one of the main people to jumpstart this conversation about making sure that people who are part of the Jewish community from all different backgrounds be accepted and uplifted for who they are. Anything else anyone wants to add from this first group?
You know, I'll quickly add that at the end there, Jure said something that I really appreciated, which is that the conversion process from this text reads as it can be very affirming. And I know as our group was reading it, it was so heavy on the heart and so less on the exterior. And I'm thinking also about that passage that we read with Ruth, and that's just how it reads. So I think it's nice, right? Like it's very like warm and welcoming, and how it reflects on Judaism and the community. So very, very much appreciate the literature as well.
Yeah, and that word affirming, I think, is so important, Claudia. I'm glad you bring that in, right? Because for Angela, she wasn't converting to become a Jew. She always was a Jew. It was an affirmation. And sometimes there are people who actually found out that they had so many relatives in their families who were Jewish, even though they've been kind of separate from that in their upbringing. And so for them, it might not actually be about converting in a way. It's an affirmation of who they are. Or very often people tell me when they're part of within the conversion process that they feel like they've had a Jewish soul their whole lives. And so in a lot of ways, it is this affirmation. It's no, this is who I am, and I just want to mark this moment. So I think that's really important to bring into conversation. What about our second text with Chris? Does anyone want to kind of share his story a little bit?
I enjoyed the story. I've actually known a couple of Jewish Chris's, ignoring the elephant in the room Jewish Chris. But it had never occurred to me that, in fact, the name was irrelevant. And in fact, we have lots of non-traditionally named Jewish people that are in the Bible. So I found that to be sort of a uplifting and inclusive story. I liked it a lot.
Well, a lot of people haven't had a chance to read it. So can you say just a little bit more about it?
His mention was that Moses was named by an Egyptian mother, and to go to Moses, if I could find him and talk to him and say, your name isn't particularly Jewish, I think you should change it to some other name. David is a good one. That's ridiculous because Moses is clearly Jewish. And he mentions Ruth. Ruth is not a Jewish name by origin, although it is certainly a Jewish name by practice. But no one ever said Ruth was not Jewish because of her name. And I think that's the takeaway from this. The name is irrelevant.
Thank you so much, David. Anyone else from that group want to bring in anything?
We're a very shy group.
I guess so.
I just skimmed it really quick and I was listening to what I'm sorry, what's your name again? It's not on Zoom.
David.
Oh, I'm David.
Okay, David. I was also listening to what David said. And again, it also goes hand in hand with if you have, you know, a Korean name or an Asian name or a Black name, like, and I was also thinking about this too, like a lot of pressure to kind of like, you know, lean into a Jewish name, but you don't have to because every name is Jewish. Like, any diversity is beautiful. And like David said, Ruth isn't a Jewish name by origin, and neither is Moses, but those are both Jewish names.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Exactly. What about our third and final group? Would anyone like to kind of clue us in a little bit to what you read?
Sure. It's the story of a woman who is in an interfaith marriage. Her husband is Jewish at the start of the story. And at the beginning, she doesn't have any intention of converting to Judaism. There's no pressure to convert to Judaism. But as the marriage goes on, she feels a personal attraction to the Jewish religion and starts the conversion process. Her husband attends some of the sessions with her, which she has some ambivalence about, like, should I have done it by myself? Should he have been there? But yeah, eventually she converts. And she goes through she has a mikvah, she goes to the, I forget what it's called, the rabbinate, the 3-person board.
Yeah,
thank you.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's the story.
I thought what was powerful in her story was that indeed it was, she says, if she hadn't met her husband, she probably wouldn't become Jewish, but she didn't become Jewish in order to be married. She really came to it through a process. It was the class, and it was gaining an understanding about why her husband participated in the learning opportunity with her, because she indeed, like Dan said, she thought she was doing this on her own, and she was a bit confused, and then she kind of rather enjoyed him participating, and he even went with her when she had the private meetings with the rabbi. So it was powerful in that she didn't do it for an ulterior or an outside reason. It really came from, well, her gut, her heart.
Yeah, and that's really, really important, right? Because it's a very personal decision.
I have a conversion story to share. my best friend, who was my roommate in college, was raised as an Italian Catholic by the Christian Brothers. So he had a fairly intense Catholic upbringing. When I knew him in college, he was somewhat of a lapsed Catholic. And later on, when we both moved out to the West Coast, he met a woman who was in my wife's first year law school class who was Jewish. And it was one of these love at first sight, whirlwind romances. 2 months later, bended knee, asked her to marry him. And when he told us that, my wife's only comment to him was, "We're really excited for you, but you understand that Michelle is very Jewish." And Jim looked at her and said, "No, she's not." And Linda said, "Yes, she is, Jim. You should talk to her about this." Well, I was an usher in their wedding. They had a non-Jewish wedding when they got married. And over the years, they had 2 sons, and she was a Hebrew teacher. So both of their sons were raised Jewish. Both of them were taught Hebrew. And I was always fascinated that on Saturday when they were at service, Jim would send me these very long emails about what the Jewish holiday was or what the Torah reading was of the day. And I knew he was a bit of an academic, but I just thought this is very fascinating. And after about 16 years of getting these emails, I just said to him one day, "Have you ever thought about converting?" And I just got this horrified reaction from him and all of these excuses and all of these reasons. And I just said, "Okay, fine. Sorry I raised the question." Long story short, right before his 25th wedding anniversary, he called me up and asked me if I would be willing to be an usher again, because for their 25th wedding anniversary, he had converted and he wanted to have a full Jewish wedding. And they have been very happily married for about 40 years. And I told Jim I was extraordinarily proud of him because I believe the reason he converted was for his family. His wife, his 2 sons, who were very Jewish, I think gave him, for the first time in his life, a sense of family and a sense of community.
That's beautiful. Thank you for bringing that in, Liam. Thank you so much. And I think everyone has their own journey, right? There are people who are signed up for this class, not necessarily because you're interested in converting to Judaism, and it doesn't have to be your journey, but because you have loved ones who are Jewish and you want to learn some more about it. And that's a beautiful thing. There are people who are here because they're exploring whether conversion is right for them. And there's people here who are Jewish and have been part of the Jewish community for some time, but who just want to have a deeper kind of knowledge base. And whatever the reason is, I'm just so glad that you're here to kind of explore and to dig in, because that's a beautiful story that you shared, Liam. And all of these are beautiful stories of conversion. But if conversion isn't the thing that's right for you, I just want to say that's okay too. You're welcome within the community as well. And that's a really important thing to know and to be said. So sorry, go ahead.
The other side of that is my daughter was madly in love with a young man, and they were getting very serious, and he was Catholic and she had been brought up Jewish. And they were going to figure it out, but his parents were so staunch that right after Easter he said, "I love you and we can't be together." And it was heartbreaking for both of them, but it was the right thing. A sheep and a cow or something like that. And I guess we come around to what it is we're supposed to choose and what we're supposed to do. But yeah, some of those choices are hard. I've seen people convert because they loved someone, and so they converted under duress in order to please that person and be with that person. And maybe they embrace it later and maybe they don't. But those are like all these other decisions, those are all personal decisions. So, you know, you're welcome if you want to, and if you don't want to, that's okay. And if we can get along anyway or be together anyway, then we can, but we may not be able to.
Is it okay? Like, I know it's already 8. I was wanting to kind of add on to something of what Richard said.
Yeah, please.
So I think it's really interesting when there's people that, you know, are from different faiths that maybe are very like strict, like how you were saying, Catholics, and there was Jewish, and I don't know, it just kind of, it's difficult because it's a personal decision, but it also sounds like it's more so influenced like, oh man, if I marry someone who's Jewish and isn't another Catholic, or vice versa, my family won't approve, they'll disown, they'll, you know, it ends up being like I'm doing this because I don't want to lose my family. And you're kind of just denying yourself or denying the person that you love. And it kind of, like, I feel particularly a certain way about that, but ultimately it is up to those two individuals. But, you know, it's just a shame, I guess, at least to me. And it's funny because the way I ended up going to this temple I'm going to, Temple Beth Israel in Fresno, a woman who is a reformed, who's Reformed Jewish, she married a Catholic. So it's like, I don't know, you know, it can work, but it really depends on, you know, the people.
Yeah, I could say my very staunchly Catholic family was not happy about me dating a Jew. So
Then again, for some people, it's very shallow. I have a cousin who married, well, she was married and divorced, some fellow, but then she married a Jewish man. And she followed Jewish rituals and such. And then, unfortunately, he died of cancer at a rather young age. And then she stopped. It was just a big nothing to her. She never really became Jewish. I don't think she ever really thought about it very much. And if she had, it was just a show. It wasn't anything that made anything. So perhaps it's rather shallow for some people. And it would be unfortunate if, in the instance you described, where somebody was Catholic and wanted to please their parents and remain Catholic, but married the Jewish fellow, and then can you imagine the turmoil? I mean, being torn in two directions with that?
Yeah.
It would just seem to me, even if they were not a very serious Catholic themselves, the tension within the family would be horrible.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much meat to dig into here, because this is about the complexity of relationships, right? And when people come from different backgrounds, be they religious backgrounds or different cultural backgrounds, there's a lot of learning and figuring out, how do we respect one another and how do we move forward? And if we choose to have children, what do we want to do? In terms of how we raise it. I mean, these are all great questions, and I wish that we had another hour so that we can continue to discuss them, because I think they're worthy of being discussed. But right now, because we don't, and because I have 20 minutes to kind of sum up everything that I need to sum up, I'm going to change the subject here. But I'm really appreciative of all of your feedback, of all of your kind of stories, because this is real. Right? All of us need to make the decisions that are right for us and right for the people that we love. And that's a tall order sometimes. I completely respect that. I'm going to bring us back. I'm sorry, this is a little bit quick, but oh, we already did this. There we go. So I wanted to kind of talk about the diversity within the Jewish community. Okay, thanks for your comment there, Jill. I think that's why the woman in the last story was so clear about the fact that her conversion was purposeful and not just because her husband was Jewish. I think you're exactly right. That the kind of idea here is that whatever we choose to do, it should be because it feels right and it's on our terms, and that we feel really good about the decisions that we make for ourselves. So This, like I said before, some of the statistics that are here are based on the Pew study or based on things from a couple of years ago. I'll talk about some of the differences, but about 7.8 billion people and about 15 million Jews are in the world. And Jews are about 0.2 of 1% of the world's population, and that 80% of the Jews in the world live in either Israel or the United States, which is roughly about 7 million in each of them. So that's just kind of basic. Okay. Okay, and here are some kind of, let's see, I'm just going through my notes really quickly. All right, so there's about 7.2 million Jews in the United States as of 2019, and about 6.5 million Jews in Israel as of 2018. Obviously, that number's gone up a little bit. And approximately 400,000 Jews in Canada, which is about 1% of the population. According to the most recent Pew study, Jews are about 2% of the US population. So staying about the same. But here's what's really interesting, is that researchers estimate that about 12 to 15% of American Jews are Jews of color. In the most recent Pew study, it showed that 8 to 10% of respondents identified as being Jews of color, but the thought is that that number is actually higher than what the Pew study said, because a lot of people might have chosen not to answer that question, in part because there was a history from a while ago of Jews being said, or Jews being told, hey, you don't look Jewish. And what we're learning is that's not the case, right? How a person looks is no indication of whether or not they are part of the Jewish community. So there's an estimate also that about 20% of the Jewish population in the US is diverse, including individuals who have converted to Judaism, individuals who have been adopted into Jewish families and raised as Jews, the multicultural children of partners between Ashkenazi Jews and people of color, and those who are themselves the generational descendants of Jews of color, and those of Sephardic and Mizrahi heritage. So Ashkenazi Jews generally means Jews that come from Europe, and Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews are Jews that come from Spain, Jews that come from maybe South American countries, different places. Iraq, Iran, like different places in the Middle East could fall under that. In fact, I recently learned that only about 32% of the people in Israel are white. So the Jewish community in Israel is incredibly diverse, and now the Jewish community in the US is starting to become as diverse as the community in Israel, which is kind of interesting. I think I'm freezing. I'm not sure if you all can still hear me.
You're good.
You're good.
Okay. Everything is freezing on my screen, so it's making me nervous. All right, so one other thing that I wanted to kind of bring in here. Well, actually, first, those statistics that I just kind of threw at you, are any of them surprising to you?
Most of them.
I thought Jews were more spread out all over the world. I had no idea there's so many in the US and Israel only.
Yeah, it's true. The Jewish community is really largely in those two pockets.
I think there's it's a novel idea, and I think Rabbi Rick Jacobs talked about it today on a webinar about the Pew study, and it's really true. The population of Jews really are of Jews of color. the population that's increasing are Jews of color. And that's something for us all to be aware of and welcome. It was news. It wasn't new news, but it was news, if that makes any sense. Now you're frozen, I think, Cassie, right, everybody?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you. Your video's
I
just
just
frozen.
keep freezing
Yeah.
because my computer overheats on hot days and it does some funny things. That's what's going on. And it's pretty hot today.
Oh yeah, Los Angeles. I understand.
Exactly. So a few more things that I just want to bring in, which has to do with like immigration to the United States and the Jewish people within our American culture. I'm stopping sharing my screen in hopes that all of this stuff will work the way that it needs to. But we know Jewish people come from many places around the world and are members of a variety of ethnic and racial groups, and therefore Jewish culture is rich and varied. What we also know is that between 1880 and 1924, there were about 2.5 million Eastern European Jews who immigrated to the US. Those are Ashkenazi Jews. And these communities came to be thought of as white, and their descendants make up the majority of North American Jews today. And in Israel, just over half of Jews are descended from Jewish families in North Africa and Arab countries. So it's a little bit different. So one of the questions that I want to then bring in here was the one that we just had up on our screen a second ago of what elements compose a culture? What are the things that really make a culture?
Kind of a shared, I guess, idea or a shared kind of belief, I think, or something that just kind of connects and, makes that bond, like that first step.
Yeah, you have the something special in common.
Language.
Language can certainly be that connector, absolutely.
Traditions.
Traditions, food, I heard, absolutely. We saw that with the kimchi example, right?
Festivals or festivities.
The way we celebrate, absolutely.
Histories.
Yeah, and there's so many diverse kind of histories depending on where we come from and what our particular traditions are.
Values, shared values.
Mm-hmm.
Clothing? Did someone mention clothing?
Yeah, clothing could definitely do that as well.
Music?
Music, beautiful, exactly. We have food, we have music, language, dress.
Dance.
Dance, different types of art, right? Dance is one of them, music, how we express all of these different things. There's so many different ways that define a culture. And so when we then think about if we have such a diverse Jewish community, and culture is both a Jewish thing, we have Jewish culture, but there also are little pockets of Jews from different places. Sephardi Jews are going to have some really particular cultures and food and music and different things, right? Jews living in China are going to have different kinds of foods and things that they're going to want to have. And so all of these things come together. And in fact, there are different Jewish foods depending on where you come from. So one of the Ashkenazi quintessential Jewish foods is matzo ball soup, Jewish penicillin, right? But within, like a Roman Jewish community, I can't even pronounce the name of the dish because I'm just not familiar with it, but fried artichokes are a very common Jewish dish within the Roman Jewish community. And so there's real differences there, and how beautiful that is that we can get to know one another through our food and culture. Klezmer music, which you might have heard with all the stringed instruments and everything else, comes out of a musical tradition in Eastern Europe. Out of the Middle East, there's totally different kind of music that's coming out of the Jewish tradition. Jewish languages, right? We have Hebrew, we have Aramaic. It hasn't been spoken in thousands of years, but we have Aramaic. It shows up in some of our prayers. We also have Yiddish, which is a conglomeration of, it's like Judeo-German, basically. And we have Ladino, which is a connection of Spanish culture, which is largely Spanish. So we have lots of different ways in which culture is shown through this diversity. I'm hoping that I can share my screen. Are there any questions or thoughts on that while I try to get this going again?
We're also united in prayer. And I think prayer is one of the things that actually transcends all of the idioms. And it also transcends, in some sense, from Reformed to Orthodox. You know, our foundational prayers are universal.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, that is such a good segue into this next piece that I want to bring in, which actually has to do with the different denominations. So here's some of the different kinds of foods that are popular within Jewish culture. Some of them might be familiar to you. But I have this chart that I want to go into, which is talking about some of the denominations in Judaism. And there's a lot of diversity here. So there are more than 4 denominations in Judaism, but these are like the most kind of common ones. Reform Judaism, conservative, Reconstructionist, and Orthodox. And truthfully, Orthodox is such a broad category. It goes from the ultra-Orthodox, Haredim, who wear the black hats and have the hair curls that come down called payas, all the way to modern Orthodox who shave and, you know, might wear a kippah, but are not, are far more liberal in terms of maybe being egalitarian and things like that. So there's a wide array there. But this is just kind of a starting point of some of the differences between them. So Reform Judaism, there are many ways to understand God. And there's no, this is how you must understand God. There's many different ways to understand God, and that's a wonderful thing. If you look over here in conservative Judaism, there's that same kind of idea. There's lots of different ways to understand God, and that's wonderful. Reconstructionist is kind of interesting. It's a little bit more humanist. Well, kind of. So a source of the highest human values and transcendent feelings. That's the understanding of God. So it doesn't anthropomorphize God in the same way that the Torah does. It really is seen as like a force or a source. So it's a little bit different in Reconstructionist than conservative and Reform. Within Reform and conservative, you can have these Reconstructionist beliefs because it is so specific, but it's one of many potential beliefs that people might have within the sect. And finally, for Orthodoxy, generally God is a personal deity whose providence is reality. God is real. There's no denying it. We believe in God and the God of the Torah. That's how it is. So any questions or kind of thoughts about that?
It's very straightforward. This is the most straightforward explanation I've ever seen of these various denominations.
And of course, it's overly simplistic. There's a lot of variety within here, but it's just kind of a starting point.
My sister is a Reconstructionist Jew, and she talks about God. They talk in her congregation about godliness.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I come to understand Reconstructionism. And when I look at this definition here, I think of it as godliness.
Right, right. It's not this being called God. Rather, it's this source of something. I like that, godliness. That's beautifully put.
Do we have an idea of kind of how many people fall into these broad categories?
Yeah, and the Pew study actually has that. The vast majority of Jews fall under the Reform category. Of course, there are people who don't fall in any of the categories, right? There are people who say, I'm just Jewish, meaning I don't see myself defined by one movement, but I do consider myself to be a part of the larger Jewish community. But in terms of movements, Reform is the biggest of them. Conservative is next, but Orthodoxy is growing because Orthodox Jews have a lot of children generally. So the percentage of Orthodoxy has grown according to the most recent Pew study by a little bit. And Reconstructionist is definitely the smallest of these denominations on the screen. There are other denominations also. I didn't even bring in Humanist. I didn't bring in Renewal, which are both kind of offshoots. Those are much smaller. So let's look at Torah really quickly, just because I'm noticing the time. So in Reform Judaism, Torah is a living God-inspired document that was written by human beings, right? So this is something that is a text that is divine. It has divine things in it. It does connect us with God, but it connects us with God in a different kind of way. It's more, our people have been struggling with God always. And this is a book that connects us with that struggle and connects us to God through it. That's the kind of idea within Reform Judaism. Within Conservative Judaism, Torah is the revealed but not literal word of God, as trying to figure out what was the word that I meant to write there.
Like redacted. Redacted.
That's what I meant to write. Thank you. As redacted through human transmission. And then if we go to Reconstructionism, the Torah is a collection of writings from different people marking the attempt to strive for salvation and self-fulfillment. Which in some ways isn't all that far off from the Reform way. It just depends on how you kind of read that and understand it. And then through Orthodox perspective, it's wisdom of divine origin that was first handed to Moses on Mount Sinai. It's far more literal. Any questions about any of that?
Is there a way that you can send us these slides? They're wonderful, the ones that we haven't gotten throughout the course.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I could definitely do that. Okay, the last one, there's so many other categories we could have on here. I was trying to make it a little more simplistic. So the last one I felt really important to bring in is Jewish law, which is also called halacha. So from Reform perspective, it encompasses a wide array of practice. Ethical aspects of the laws are binding as long as they are inclusive. Ritual mitzvot, meaning how we celebrate different holidays, are meant to inspire spiritually, and individuals make choices through knowledge. So you can have people in the same Reform community, one person keeps kosher, meaning they eat certain animals, or some people might say, nope, not doing that. I have bacon cheeseburgers all the time. And both of them are making choices through knowledge, and both are uplifted for the knowledge-based choices that they make. You can have people doing very different things in the same community, and you're still respected equally within that community. That's where Reform Judaism is. Conservative, all decisions are made with a nod to an appreciation for tradition, adapted to respond to the modern social needs. Rabbinic rulings are binding. So when a change is needed, for example, when the seminary, the conservative seminary, was trying to decide, do we want to ordain rabbis if they're non-gender binary, if they're LGBTQ? They needed to go through old halachot, old rulings, and try to figure out a way within those rulings to say, yes, we can do that. And because they had to go through those means, the process was much, much slower than through Reform Judaism, for example. But they were able to get there because morally, they felt that was the right thing to do. Reconstructionist. So it is binding, but can be interpreted and applied to new situations throughout the judgment of rabbinic sages. So Reconstructionist is really an offshoot of conservative. You can see some similarities there. And in Orthodoxy, it is binding, halacha or Jewish law, and must be adhered to. Learned rabbis can help us to apply these rulings to modern situations that we face, but it's the rabbis who make the decisions, not the individuals. So any questions about all of this? I know I just threw a whole lot at you in the past 3 seconds. Okay. Let's get this up. Okay, just a few other really quick things. So I included just a little bit more about Reform Judaism on here because I'm more an authority to talk about Reform Judaism than I am about any of the other movements, since I am a Reform Jew. Okay, Reform Judaism sees the Torah as a living God-inspired document. Reform Judaism believes that Judaism must change and adapt to modern times. It embraces a wide variety of practice, is committed to the ongoing work of pursuing justice, is committed to inclusion of interfaith families, Jews of color, LGBTQIA Jews, their families, and Jews with different abilities, etc. Inclusivity is a really, really important value. And finally, I wanted to bring us, and I'm seeing the time, so I'm going really fast now, Jewish values about community. So these three different texts just kind of bringing in that all Israel or all Jews are responsible for one another. Hillel said, do not separate yourself from the community. And Hillel also said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? And as we're kind of concluding this conversation about the importance of Jewish community, I'm wondering if you have any reflections or thoughts based on any or all of these three quotes.
Perhaps if you could give us some idea of additional reading, that would be helpful.
That's a great question, Jim. I can certainly do that after the class.
I have a question about the number one.
Yeah.
Does that, it says all Israel is responsible for one another. Does that include non-Jews?
So in this particular case, what it's talking about is all Jews are responsible for one another, but let me put that in context, right? So because we are a minority group, sometimes if someone sees us as a Jew, then one action that we take as a Jew, we become then an emissary on behalf of the Jewish people. And so there's this need to really be careful because we are doing things on behalf of the people. We're responsible for one another. We're put in that perspective. It's not to say that we shouldn't be helping and that we're not responsible to act in response to needs of people who aren't Jewish. It's just saying that as part of one family, one community, we have a real responsibility to take care of one another because we're linked in this communal way. Does that help?
Yeah, I don't happen to agree with it, but yes, it does help. Yes, I understand. Thank you. I guess I just have some, yeah, it seems somewhat exclusionary to me.
Well, it's not meant to be exclusionary because it's not saying we're responsible for one another, but we're not responsible for anyone else. That's not the statement here. There are statements all over in Jewish text in the Torah that say that we are responsible for everyone. This just is just a particular reminder. It's like you're responsible for the people in your family. It's just, we have these circles of influence, these circles of connection, right? And if we are saying the Jewish people are my people, then there's this feeling of deep connection with people within the Jewish community. Also remember, if we're going back to the text from earlier from Deuteronomy, the Jewish community doesn't necessarily only mean people who are Jewish. It actually means people who connect themselves with the Jewish community. So it's a little broader than just that as well.
It reminds me of love thy neighbor as thyself.
Yes, and that is an extremely important part of Jewish teachings. In fact, Hillel, the same Hillel who said these two texts here, also said exactly that. Do not treat your neighbor as you wouldn't want to be treated, is essentially what he said.
I think as being a Jew, when we hear that a Jew has done something wrong, we all feel responsible and we all worry about that.
Yeah.
If that is responsibility for one another's actions, I don't see any other group of people that really go, oh my gosh, it was a Jew. And we feel somehow responsible for that action too, or bad about that action more so.
Yeah, but Gail, we feel guilty and responsible for everything. So
Okay, there you go.
Well, I think like when Bernie Madoff, that all happened. I think that was like a
yeah.
huge blow for Jews, American Jews, right?
But why did he have to be a Jew, right? Like, oh no, now there's going to be something else against us as a people, kind of a thing.
It's interesting because the way you guys are describing it, obviously these two aren't the same, but it's similar, at least from like being in like the LGBTQIA community, where it's like, oh, if someone who's gay or trans or, you know, anything, one of those, and if they do something that is harmful to others, themselves, or to community, like a group of people, then it's like, oh, you know, hey, this person's from this community, the gay community, this is why they're bad. So it's like that kind of general, like, you know, they're going to find like a reason to hate a group of people because of one person's actions.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's a really apt comparison right there. Jews are not alone in that, certainly, but there is that feeling that definitely exists.
And I think one of the reasons that Jews have been able to survive throughout the ages is because we look like everybody else. We if you see a black person, they're a black person. If you see other ethnicities, you see them. You don't see Jews, and we're able to hide in plain sight, and that's wonderful and awful at the same time.
I think just to balance what was just said about, you know, if one person does something wrong, that we will look at everyone like that person as also being bad. I think the reverse is true. If you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think so many people thought so much more about Jewish people because of her stand for righteousness. So I think it cuts both ways.
Thank you.
Yeah, it absolutely can. All right, I know there's a lot of material here. I want to walk us through. I didn't mean to do that. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip over that. I just wanted to quickly kind of go through in our first class that these were the kind of things that we learned in our very first class about God, and some of the surprises that we had in learning about the ways in which God is spoken about and could be understood within Jewish tradition. In this past class, or the second class, we talked about God and the way in which we observe Shabbat and the different kind of texts that are part of tradition and the synagogue and how it works and what it's like to be part of that. And we learned a lot about that. And today, I know we didn't do our learn kind of tab for today because we're out of time, but I think that, I mean, does anyone want to share just a couple of things that you learned from the class today that maybe were surprising?
I love the quote from Ruth.
Yeah, it's a great quote, isn't it?
Yeah, didn't know that one.
I think the meaning behind, or meanings behind, people's choice to convert, powerful.
Yeah. And everyone has their own journey, right?
Yes.
I think that there are more non-white Jews. That surprised me, and that pleased me.
Yeah. Thank you, Eve. Absolutely. I think there's so much to take in, and right, we've only spent 4.5 hours together. So there's only so much that we can kind of go over within that time period. But I think we touched on a lot of things. In our very first class, I asked what you wondered about Judaism, and these were some of the questions that you came up with. In bold are some of the things that we've actually had a chance to touch on. Have we fully answered any of these? No, we certainly haven't, but we've touched on some of them. all of the things that are handled that are not even in bolds are things that we really haven't had a chance to touch on, because again, this is just a 4.5-hour class in total. But that's why we're actually going to be having an introduction to Judaism class that's going to be starting in the fall. And that introduction to Judaism class is open to anyone who wants to be a part of it. It's going to be on Sunday mornings starting on October 10th. It's going to be 9:30 to 11:30. I have a complete schedule. I've submitted everything to the URJ, so it should be posted soon. They're in a period of transition with some leadership within this department, so it's taking a little longer for it to get posted than it normally would. But as soon as that is up, I'm going to email everyone, and you certainly can feel free to be part of it. There is a cost that's associated with this class, but if finances are an issue and that's something that is hard to get over, please reach out to me confidentially. I'm more than happy to help to make sure it's something that you can do if it's something that you would like to.
Well, I just wanted to take this time to say thank you, Rabbi Cassie, for doing this course, A Taste of Judaism, because I think it's really important that there's things like this out there that's accessible and that people can, learn about, because, I don't think a lot of things that should be talked about or that we should learn is really ever talked about. But I appreciate the time and, the effort you've done to put this together for, us.
Thank you so much, Dre. And it's been such a pleasure just getting to know so many of you in this class. I'm going to put together a couple of books and other resources that I'll email out if they're helpful. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions about things, if you want to learn more, if you want to take part in anything through the temple, you're always welcome to do so. And yeah, just thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Bye,
Thank you so much.
everybody.
Good night.